Joining me now are a pair of familiar faces, two presidents and also Wall Street power brokers. Roger Altman, Deputy Treasury Secretary for Bill Clinton and co-founder of Evercore Partners. Glenn Hubbard, who was chair of the Council of Economic Advisors under George W. Bush and author of Seeds of Destruction. We're also joined by Meredith Whitney, analyst and CEO of Meredith Whitney Advisory Group, and Glenn Hutchins, co-founder of the private equity firm Silver Lake. I am pleased to have all of them here to talk about this monumental result today and what it means for America, what it means for the economy, and what it means for the next 2 years. I begin with Roger Altman. Paul Krugman, who writes from the left about economics, said, "They'll refuse to do anything," talking of the Republicans, "to boost the economy now, claiming to be worried about the deficit, while simultaneously increasing long-run deficits with the irresponsibility of tax cuts. My advice to all, be afraid, be very afraid."
Well, Charlie, I think the likely result, at least from a legislative point of view of tonight's election, is gridlock or close to gridlock. So I don't think there's going to be a big change, a sea change at all in the course of economic policy, because I don't think the Republicans will have sufficient control, for example, in the Senate, to implement that. And yes, there'll have to be some decisions made, for example, right off the bat on extension of the Bush tax cuts and whether there's a compromise which allows all of them to be continued or not. I suspect there will be a compromise there. And of course, the Bowles-Simpson Commission on the budget is reporting on December the 1st, and we'll see its deficit reduction recommendations and whether they can find favor, whether they center around Social Security and a harder freeze on spending, including defense, and whether that could somehow coalesce in terms of enough support in Congress to do something like that. But I think from the point of view of what Mr. Krugman's afraid of, the Republicans won't have the votes to make that happen. Of course, the president continues to have the power to veto anything.
Glenn, we'll talk about tax cuts later, but let's talk about what the Republican agenda might be other than dismantling what they don't like.
Well, I think the affirmative part, Charlie, is going to be about a different vision of government, a smaller government, much more work on slimming down the entitlement programs. If we clear up where we're headed fiscally in the long term, we have room to move in the short term. And I expect a 1-2 punch. Discussion of the long term, freeing up a discussion of fiscal policy in the short term. I expect the Congress to be quite active.
And do you believe that there will be a kind of austerity budget coming from the Speaker of the House?
I believe we will see an austerity budget, not for this year, but a path for the budget, particularly in the entitlements area, that gets the country back on the right path. There's much we have to do there, and until we fix that long-term problem, we can't really talk about the short term. The administration's done it the other way around.
So what happens to economic growth?
Well, unfortunately, that's rather baked in. The next couple of years, or at least next year and a half, are going to be slow, and probably in the general vicinity of 2% in terms of real growth, which is not enough to improve labor market conditions almost at all. So between now and the end of 2011, for example, I think we're going to see tepid growth and unchanged conditions, really, unfortunately, in labor markets. But that transcends the election results tonight. We were going to see that regardless of what the final tallies are tonight.
There was a foreword in your new book, Seeds of Destruction, in which Amity Shales writes that the Republicans want to go back and live in the 50s. Democrats want to go back and work there.
Well, I think what Amity's referring to is a theme of the book, which is broad-based prosperity is what the country needs. We need economic growth, and we need it to be shared. We know how to do this in economics. We did it in the 1950s. We have done it in our country. The right policies can do it again today.
You worked in the Clinton administration. Some say that what the Democrats want to do is go back to the Clinton economic policies now, and that the president may very well take a lesson from the way this president might take a lesson from the president you served in terms of dealing with a new Republican majority.
Well, we all know that President Clinton proved remarkably adaptable and turned the disastrous election result of 1994, where the Republicans again took the House at that time, into a plus for himself and actually for the country. But he moved quite sharply to the center. The Republicans, of course, overreached, the would-be shutdown of the government and other overreaching, and that enabled President Clinton to be easily reelected only 2 years later, and it also enabled him to continue to put forward policies which ultimately resulted in 5 or 6 of the best economic years we've had in the past 50, including, of course, the first balanced budget in 54 years, and indeed surpluses. Whether that course is available to President Obama really, Charlie, remains to be seen. You know, will there be the opening that circumstances in 95 and 96 gave to President Clinton, or will there not be? We don't know that.
We go back to Glenn Hubbard. Tax cuts, the Bush tax cuts, the president clearly has suggested he's in favor of extending the middle-class tax cuts and will make at some point a different decision about those over $250,000. How do you see this playing out?
Well, I think the right answer for the economy is to extend all of the Bush tax cuts until we're ready to have a serious national conversation about 2 subjects. One's the size of government, whether we can afford any of the tax cuts, and second is tax reform. I see no argument for punishing high-income taxpayers in a recovery from a recession. A 2-year extension is exactly the right answer, and I think that's what the president will ultimately sign.
Glenn Hutchins?
Yes, sir.
Welcome.
Thank you.
Nice to see you. Tell me what you think the president should do in recommending and what the Congress might do in extending the Bush tax cuts.
Well, look, Charlie, I think the tax cuts are one part of a much bigger issue. And I think the very biggest issue facing us as a country, and the issue I hear from foreign leaders, business and political leaders as I travel, is the U.S. fiscal situation in general. The one thing I think government can do to stimulate investment and job growth in this country is to get its own house in order. And it's the only really important thing they can and should do. The tax policy is a key part of that. But to think about tax policy in the absence of getting spending in order and having a long-term path to create the kind of stable future for our country that we business people can build our business on top of is pretty much the only important thing right now.
Much is often said about certainty and uncertainty. Uncertainty about tax policy, uncertainty about regulation, uncertainty about trade. Is that an issue for most business people you know, and how will certainty be established so that they can make decisions that will affect their own investment?
Look, the biggest issue of uncertainty for business people is their revenues. Right. What economists call aggregate demand. And in a world that Rogers portrayed, I think, quite accurately, of anemic economic growth in our country, there's a tremendous amount of uncertainty about being able to get back to the levels of economic performance we had before the crisis. That's the biggest piece. The second piece is then, in the longer term, can we have certainty about the type of fiscal reform that enables our country to be stable, so that we can invest for the longer term?
We're waiting for the answers to the recommendations to come out of the Deficit Commission on December 1st, as you suggested. We'll know more about what they recommend to deal with that big issue. Put the United States in the context of other countries in terms of its tax policy, whether it's corporate tax, whether it's income tax, whether it's value-added tax or sales tax. Where are we and where might we go?
Well, if you look at the so-called richer countries, the OECD countries, in terms of the federal tax burden and all aspects of it, we rank relatively low among those, I believe it's 28 countries that are included in the OECD, relatively low. Now, that comes about because we don't have a value-added tax, which most other of those countries do have, and our income tax rates may strike some as quite high, but by international standards, they're not that high. Now, the corporate tax rate in the United States actually is relatively high by international standards.
And should be reduced in your judgment?
Eventually, it should be reduced.
Not while you need growth more than anything else.
Well, we do need a lower corporate tax rate, but as Glenn was saying, it really needs to be part of an overall approach to tax reform on the one hand and deficit reduction on the other, when those two are going to have to be part of the same package in the end, because there's going to have to be some additional revenue in terms of ultimately fixing our deficit problem, and that's where tax reform comes in. But our tax rates, to answer your question directly, are not, at least at the federal level, especially high by standards of the wealthier countries.
Glenn is anxious to jump in.
Well, I think that's right at one level, but it may not be helpful to your question, Charlie, because we do rely more on income and corporate taxes than many of our peer countries. And indeed, countries that tend to have larger governments rely very heavily on consumption taxes, because that's the most efficient way to fund a larger government. That's a lesson for the United States. we could cut our corporate tax into the high 20s from the present 35 with minimal revenue loss. It's something we should do.
I want to come back to this question about certainty, and you talked to a lot of CEOs. What are they looking for in the next 2 years that will influence their investment policies and their capital allocation? Because most of them, or certainly the large ones, are sitting on a lot of cash, waiting for something. Is it demand or is it certainty? Or both?
Well, there are two sides of the equation. So the demand is rich outside the United States. The demand is weak inside the United States. But resoundingly, the one thing they're looking for is leadership. And antagonism is not leadership. So if you had leadership positions on policies like taxes, like fiscal issues, like corporate governance, like reg reform, that would be certainty you can live with and plan on. But if the rules are changing constantly, it's very difficult to budget. And so that's why so many corporations are sitting on so much cash, because they don't know what their needs are going to be in the future. And that then creates, at least for the banks, an environment where you're hoarding cash, you're not lending. A lot of the regulatory reforms are already baked in, so they're not political things that can change on the fly. I think you're going to see big changes amongst the financial landscape where people get kicked out of the financial system, kicked out of the banking system. There hasn't been a whiteboard to imagine, okay, if this happens, what next? And I think leadership could come in and rectify a lot of that, but that's what they're really looking for. And I think bipartisan leadership, that's what the Republicans are in a tricky situation, because if they slow things down to such an extent, the unemployment rate doesn't move, and then they get kicked out of office. So someone's got to take a leadership position, and someone's got to go cross aisle once they take the leadership position.
Who might that be, Glenn?
That's a good question. The thing that's really bothering me tonight is, as I talk to a bunch of smart people, including some of the people around the table here, most people think this is a prescription for paralysis. It's a prescription for gridlock. And if we have that problem, and nothing gets done, and we continue with the same sort of fiscal policies and trajectory that we have today, Katie, bar the door.
Meredith, you've heard Lizzie's report. Tell me, where do you think states, we'll talk about the housing crisis, but also what the implications are for states?
Well, a lot of the states' problems are linked to the housing crisis, because if you look at the rate of growth in state spending, it's linked to the rate of GDP growth and resulting from housing. So it's not coincidental that she mentions Nevada and Florida and California and Arizona. She didn't mention Arizona, but these are all states that have some of the largest budget gaps. So they have to cut spending the most dramatically, raise taxes the most dramatically. You cut spending, you hurt the poor, right? So you're cutting state programs. You also cut government jobs. You raise taxes, and then you have a mobility issue. So there's tax arbitrage. So one thing we're talking about is what the administration does on taxes. At the federal level, that's one thing, but you're already starting to see states work off tax arbitrage in the country. So over 36 states have already raised taxes, are going to have to continue to raise taxes. Who's to say that you're unhappy in Florida because they implement an income tax for the first time, as New Jersey did, as Connecticut did, as we'll see if Washington State does tonight, and you move to another state because it's that much more desirable. What does that do for the longer-term economy of that state? These are big issues, and unlike the federal deficit, which sort of has a waiting for Godot quality, like we know it's a big issue, but when is the tipping point? The states are at the tipping point now. If you take out Texas, the rainy day funds, which are usually used as a buffer when states run out of money, are depleted, and federal aid runs out in June, this June. One thing worse, she mentioned Nevada. Nevada wouldn't have been able to borrow from the public securities market had it not been for the U.S. Treasury subsidizing 35% of its interest rate. So Nevada issued 40% of their debt from 2000 to date on Build America bonds. I mean, there is a massive state bailout underway, and if we don't continue it, there are going to be some significant issues faced by all of us.
On the other hand, Charlie, if we want to get this economy moving again, we've got to get the housing pig through the python. Usually when you come back from recessions the sort we've had, on average, American construction increases by about 24% in the year of recovery, the year we're currently in. We're now only increasing by about 6%. If a construction was growing at about the same rate as usually what we had, about a point to point and a half more of economic growth. That's because there's about 18 to 24 months worth of excess supply, months worth of sales of excess supply of houses. And until those get sold, until that gets cleared, you're not going to turn the construction industry and the related supply industries on, and you won't get this economy moving again. So the side of this is you have to, the foreclosure crisis is unfortunately and ironically potentially slowing down the process of healing of the economy.
But that's why Lizzie's report, where she said the White House was standing aside on this whole issue of a moratorium on foreclosures, that's really not true. The White House position may be a little understated, but the White House position is we need to do what Glenn just said. We need to allow the housing market to find its own level, the inventory of unsold homes to work itself down, to allow housing prices to stabilize and ultimately to recover, and ultimately new housing construction to take place.
That's after a year of them doing everything they could to try to prevent foreclosures, so that now the average foreclosure has been sitting in delinquency for almost 500 days.
But there's another.
I don't see it that way, Meredith.
Look, we'll come back to that.
There's another very powerful lever. Because of the conservatorship of the GSEs, the government could allow for a very large-scale refinancing of mortgages. In a normal environment, we would have seen that refinancing with mortgage rates this low. We can use the conservatorship to do that, which is equivalent of a very large long-term tax cut and not inconsistent with long-term housing reform. That is available to the administration today.
What are the political fallout of a moratorium on foreclosures? Political fallout.
Well, it depends whether you're talking about short-term or long-term. The most important thing for the country, first and foremost, and then for the Obama administration, is to see the relatively poor picture on economic growth that I described earlier at least eventually begin to improve, and stabilizing housing and eventually getting housing prices to move back up and housing construction to resume is a very important part of that. So it may be appealing short-term from a political point of view to take the Harry Reid position and say, let's have a moratorium on all foreclosures. That's short-term gain. That's short-term gain and long-term loss.
Yeah, but the question also is, how do you think the administration will the bigger question, will view what it ought to get done and can get done in this Congress?
Well, it behooves the administration, of course, to see if it can find common ground with the new Republican majority in the House and to try to make some progress so that it can, first of all, get the country moving again. That's the most important thing, but also show the voters that it's not paralyzed. And that's why this immediate decision on the extending or not extending the full amount of the Bush tax cuts is an important one. That's why the response to the Deficit Reduction Commission report due on December 1st is an important one. And that's why seeing if there's a basis for more stimulus, as Glenn Hubbard was talking about, and whether the two sides could come together on some additional stimulus, because that is what the economy needs now, would also be an important one. And maybe, I know it's a little Pollyannish, but maybe on those three issues there could be coming together and there could be some progress.
I absolutely agree. I mean, the Federal Reserve is having too much asked of it at the moment because our fiscal policy is in paralysis. There is a compromise here in short-term fiscal policy that might involve investment incentives that the president has now proposed, a payroll tax cut, extension for a temporary period of time, at least, of the Bush tax cuts. I think all of that's available to the president if he wants to take it.
What will be the implications of in terms and how successful will be the Federal Reserve policy on QE2 in order to give some push?
I think it's going to be very modest. $1 trillion of quantitative easing might lower the 10-year yield by about 30 basis points. That's not what's holding back the country. It's not that it's not useful, but it's not a silver bullet. I think Chairman Bernanke and his colleagues know that.
But I think the Federal Reserve agrees entirely with Glenn, but also is seeking to lift asset values, including, by the way, stock market values. After all, there is a wealth effect. It does play into the financial condition of households, which is one of the biggest overhangs over this economy. And you've seen, as the prospect of QE2, quantitative easing, again, has come into view, that in fact the stock market has improved. It was up 3% last month. That's a big gain. So to some extent, there's some benefit associated with just lifting asset values, even if the reduction in interest rates itself doesn't affect what we'd all think of as real growth over the short term. And so I think it has a side benefit that isn't being focused on as much.
And I now want to talk about health care. And many people look at where the turn may have come for the president. And they say when he believed that he had to have health care and may have, in perception of some, taken his eye off of jobs, and the economy, that may have been a shift. What was wrong with health care so that the American people, if polls are correct, rejected it?
Well, you know, Charlie, you might remember that I worked on the last health care debacle in the Clinton White House. So I think there are two things. One is, I think it was probably a political mistake. This is way outside my brief, but it was probably a political mistake to ramrod the bill through when they lost the Massachusetts election and lost the majority. I think that turned out to be perceived to be overstepping
so at that
their bounds.
moment, do you think they should have simply pulled back or compromised?
In retrospect, they probably should have compromised.
And do you think the Republicans were ready for compromise?
That I don't know. I wasn't there. I don't know the answer. But I think the bigger issue in which people are reacting to, there's a big reaction to government spending. I mean, one of the things we're seeing across the country is government spending too much money. And one of the things that I think people understood about health care was it was big. It was $1 trillion. Just under, but people saw it as $1 trillion. And there was very, very little in the bill that got to reducing spending over time. And so it was another major expansion of a government benefit.
There was no cost containment
there was
at
no
the
cost
level they
containment.
said would be.
Right. No. There are two different issues. One was it budget neutral, which it sort of was because they increased taxes.
Deficit neutral. Right.
Yeah, deficit neutral. But the other issue is, does it actually get health care spending down as a percent of our GDP? And that monster continues to be out of control, and I think that's something people were reacting viscerally to.
And that's really the big issue. The problem is not, to my point at least, so much about political strategy. It's about economics. The way to get health care in line is to control costs. To control costs will improve access. The White House theory was exactly the other way around, that if somehow we improved access, costs would then drop. That always was silly as a matter of economics, and I think the plan was just stillborn.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Well, I just want to say that if anyone really thinks that health care, the bill that was passed, is going to be repealed, they really need to take a deep breath. That would require the president to accept the idea of repeal rather than veto it. Keep in mind the Democrats will control the Senate. Of course he's not going to accept that, and of course it's not going to be repealed. So all this discussion about repeal is
So
nice,
is there anything that the Republicans can do with respect to health care?
Well, they could probably slow spend or slow the rate of spending that's otherwise been intended for the bill to try to slow down its implementation. But what was passed and is now on the books is going to stay on the books.
How important is health care in terms of the business community and how they view it?
I think that what healthcare replaced on the agenda is more important in terms of proactive issues, in terms of getting jobs, getting the right stimulus in place, not dealing with and not addressing what is out there and available, which is a repatriation tax holiday. It was that the administration didn't seem to listen to what the people wanted, but told the people what they should want, and I think that was the reaction. No one really knows what healthcare looks like. Premiums go up almost 8 to 10% every year, regardless of healthcare reform. So, without knowing one thing to the next, how this shapes out, most people assume that if they're going to have equal access to healthcare, someone's going to pay for it. But I don't know that. Well, while small businesses will say this is the tipping point in terms of I'm not a buyer of that. I think what it replaced in terms of the things that this country really needed economically is far more damaging than what it will do.
All right. It's been my pleasure to sit with four people who know something about politics and something about business and something about investments and something about America and its future. So I want on this election night to get some final thoughts from them about what they have seen and what it means as we look at change in America.
Well, Charlie, people who know a lot about this will tell you that one of the key things Clinton did in his second part of his first term was welfare reform. And the question is, what is that for Obama? In other words, can he find something? Maybe it's repairing health care, working with the Republicans to do that. But what is that for him? And can he find, in a world with high, in a country with high and persistently high unemployment, the right politics to get to the middle? Some of that comes to the point, to the question of what will he define in the next couple of years as his base? Will it be the moderates who overwhelmingly drove his election, the independents who went the other way in this election? Or will it be the traditional base that the Democratic presidents regard on the liberal side of the aisle? And with persistently high unemployment, will he have the room, the political room, to make that move to the middle?
Meredith.
I think a couple things. Number one, the administration has to come out and say what is the appropriate home ownership rate in this country. And they have to deal with one thing. Either they default on homeowners, or they default on bond investors, or they default on someone. But they've got to draw a line in the sand. And that will make the things start moving. Unfortunately, while everyone hopes that Obama's going to move to the center, yesterday he called the Republicans and fellow Americans the sworn enemy and trying to destroy them. So I think, unfortunately, that's
There's some controversy about how that was said. Yeah, but I'm sure that'll be. It was spoken to a lot over the last several days. Roger, final thoughts.
Charlie, 2 points. First, I don't think the administration will try to gloss over the magnitude of this defeat. I actually think they will make adjustments on policy, on personnel, on their overall political approach, and likely, perhaps not immediately, move to the center. And number two, I think the tension within the Republican Party between the newly elected members, who are going to be quite far to the right, and let's call it the traditional Republicans, is going to be pretty serious, as Al Hunt was saying, and the Republican Party is going to have a hard time speaking with one voice.
Glenn, I'm out of time for my. I apologize for that. I know you were going to make a point with respect to the president, and give it to me in 5 seconds or 10 seconds. What do you think he's capable of doing?
If the president realizes he has to do something on the long term and compromise with the Republicans on short-term fiscal policy, we know he will have moved to the center. I don't expect that.
You do not expect him to move to the center.